You may have noticed that nothing dramatic announced itself, no clear signal, no defining moment. Instead, there was a gradual shift in how moments feel when you're inside them. Time didn't change its speed, but your relationship to it may have softened. You linger slightly longer before responding. You notice transitions instead of rushing through them. This isn't a disruption, it's a recalibration of attention, and it often arrives quietly. Most people expect response to look like instruction, a message, a directive. But complex systems rarely communicate that way. They adjust conditions, not outcomes. They alter context, not behavior. When conditions change, awareness adapts naturally. No permission required, no belief involved. If you've sensed something like this, it doesn't place you above anyone else. It simply places you in contact with a moment that many pass through without noticing. Not because they're incapable, but because their attention is elsewhere. Attention, after all, follows relevance, not importance. There is a difference between what is important and what is relevant. Importance is assigned socially. Relevance is felt personally. When relevance shifts, attention follows. And when attention follows something subtle, it often takes time before the mind decides what to do with it. This is where observation becomes valuable. Observation doesn't rush to interpret. It allows phenomena to repeat before naming them. It notices patterns forming rather than forcing conclusion. In education, science, psychology, and philosophy, this has always been the starting point, not certainty, familiarity. You may notice that your thoughts have changed in texture rather than content. The same concerns may still exist, but they don't pull us hard. The same questions arise, but they don't demand immediate resolution. This is not detachment.
It's modulation.
The mind adjusting its signal-to-noise ratio. Noise isn't always loud. Sometimes it's constant. When constancy breaks, even slightly, awareness responds. You don't need to know why yet. In fact, knowing too early often flattens what could have unfolded more clearly over time. There is a reason this experience feels difficult to describe. Language tends to exaggerate contrast, but this shift is more like a gradient, a slow tilt, a rebalancing that's felt more than articulated. When people try to explain it too quickly, they often reach for dramatic frameworks that don't actually fit. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is simpler, and because it's simpler, it's easier to overlook. Your awareness is responding to conditions that favor observation over reaction. This can show up in small ways. You might reread a sentence instead of skimming it. You might listen without preparing your response. Where integration happens, when the mind is not rushing to resolve, it begins to connect. Connections form slowly, often beneath conscious awareness. Later, they surface as understanding that feels obvious in hindsight. This is why the response you're noticing doesn't feel like a breakthrough. Breakthroughs are loud. This is more like erosion, steady, almost invisible, but effective over time. There's no need to assign meaning to it yet. Meaning comes after familiarity, not before. For now, it's enough to recognize that your relationship with information may be changing. Information is no longer something to consume quickly. It's something to sit with. If you notice yourself returning to certain ideas without knowing why, let that be enough. You don't need to extract value from every encounter. Sometimes repetition without analysis is how understanding incubates. This channel exists in that space, not to instruct, but to provide an environment where observation can occur without pressure, where ideas are presented without demand, where attention can settle instead of being pulled. If you stay, it's not a commitment, it's a preference, and preferences can change. For now, continue to notice what feels different about how you're listening, not what you're learning, how you're listening. That difference matters more than it seems as observation continues. Something subtle often happens. You stop trying to locate the change, and instead you notice how often you're no longer surprised by it. The unfamiliar becomes familiar without ever being defined. This is one of the clearest signs that awareness is doing its work quietly, beneath interpretation, where people expect understanding to arrive as a realization. They miss how often it arrives as normalization. A new way of noticing becomes ordinary. What once felt distinct now feels integrated, not because it lost meaning, but because it no longer needs attention to sustain itself. This is how most real learning settles in, not as a moment you can point to, but as a shift you can't easily undo. You may notice that you're less interested in extremes, less drawn to content that demands immediate agreement or disagreement. Nuance holds your attention longer now. Contradiction doesn't feel threatening. In fact, it may feel informative. This isn't indecision, it's perceptual flexibility. Perceptual flexibility allows you to hold multiple explanations at once without needing to resolve them. In complex environments, this is not a weakness, it's a necessity. Systems that are too certain collapse under new information. Systems that remain observant adapt. You don't need to think of yourself as becoming more flexible. Just notice that rigidity feels less comfortable than it used to. That discomfort isn't failure, it's feedback. Feedback is often misunderstood as correction, but at its most basic level, feedback is simply information about alignment. When something feels off, awareness adjusts. Bobu. Hence something fits, attention rests. This resting is important. Attention doesn't only move toward novelty, it also settles into coherence. Coherence is not agreement, it's internal consistency. When information aligns with how you're already processing the world, it feels quieter, less effortful. That quiet can be mistaken for boredom, but it isn't. It's resonance without stimulation. Many environments are built to prevent this. They rely on constant disruption to hold attention. But disruption trains attention to seek contrast rather than meaning. Over time, this makes subtlety harder to detect. If subtlety is becoming easier for you to notice, that's not accidental. It's the result of attention no longer being overloaded. You might experience this as a reduced need to multitask, or as an impatience with excessive framing, or as a preference for explanations that respect your ability to follow without being guided step by step. This doesn't mean you know more. It means you trust your capacity to observe. Trust is often associated with confidence, but in this context, it's closer to permission to let understanding form at its own pace. There may also be moments when you feel slightly disconnected from conversations that rely heavily on reaction. Fast opinions, immediate conclusion, performative certainty. This isn't superiority. It's simply misalignment of tempo. Different tempos support different types of awareness. Fast tempo is excellent for action. Slow tempo is essential for comprehension. Neither is better, but they serve different purposes. When you expect one to deliver what only the other can, frustration follows. Right now, your attention may be favoring comprehension. That doesn't mean action disappears. It just means action waits until it's coherent. You might also notice that some questions you used to ask no longer feel urgent, not because they were answered, but because they lost relevance. Relevance changes as perception reorganizes. This can feel unsettling if you're used to identifying yourself through certain questions or pursuits. But identity is not fixed. It's contextual. As context shifts, identification shifts with it. There's no need to resist this. Resistance often comes from trying to preserve a version of understanding that no longer matches current perception. Instead, notice what still feels stable, not as an anchor, but as a reference. Often what reigns stable is not belief, but method. How you approach information, how you listen, how you pause. These methods persist even as content changes. That persistence is more reliable than any conclusion. You may also find that silence has changed its quality. Silence used to feel empty or uncomfortable. Now it may feel informative, like a background signal rather than an absence. Silence is not the lack of information. It's the absence of interference. When interference reduces, Patterns that were always present become detectable. This ISY observation deepens over time without effort. The environment doesn't need to change further. Your sensitivity to it has already adjusted. At this stage, many people look for confirmation. They want to verify that what they're experiencing is real, shared, or recognized. That impulse is natural, but it can also pull attention outward too quickly. External confirmation is not required for internal alignment. That doesn't mean you shouldn't discuss or explore ideas with others. It simply means that the value of observation doesn't depend on consensus. Consensus often arrives later, if at all. For now, what matters is continuity, staying with the noticing without forcing interpretation. The channel isn't here to provide answers that resolve this process. It's here to support continuity, to maintain a pace where observation can keep unfolding without interruption. If you notice yourself listening without trying to extract meaning, that's not passivity, it's receptivity. Receptivity allows complexity to remain intact long enough to be understood. Understanding, when it arrives this way, doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It changes how you see future information rather than how you label past experience. That's why it's difficult to point to a single moment where something clicked. The click happened gradually across many moments of attention. You may realize later that your standards for explanation have shifted, that you require less persuasion and more coherence, less certainty and more consistency. These are not demands, they're preferences shaped by experience. And preferences, once formed, quietly guide attention with instruction. As we continue, notice how your listening has changed since the beginning of this video. Not what you agree with, not what you believe, simply how you're listening. That observation will matter more than any conclusion. At this point, something important often becomes clear without needing to be stated directly. The process you've been noticing was never moving toward a conclusion. It was moving towards stability, not the stability of fixed ideas, but the stability of method, a way of relating to information that remains steady even as content changes. This is why nothing here has asked you to decide, adopt, or agree. Decisions narrow attention. Observation widens it. When attention widens, understanding has room to reorganize itself without pressure. You may find that you're no longer waiting for something to happen, not because you've lost interest, but because the need for arrival has softened. Arrival implies an endpoint. Observation doesn't work that way. It unfolds as long as conditions allow. This doesn't mean nothing changes. Change continues. But it no longer demands recognition. It integrates quietly. One of the most overlooked aspects of awareness is that it doesn't seek to be impressive. It seeks to be accurate. Accuracy often feels plain. It doesn't announce itself. It Saint fits. When something fits, there's less internal movement around it, less argument, less reinforcement. That reduction in movement can feel like nothing is happening, when in fact alignment is taking place. Alignment here doesn't mean agreement with ideas presented. It means alignment between your attention and the pace at which information is offered. When pace matches capacity, strain disappears. You might notice that your capacity for sustained attention has increased slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to make longer explanations feel natural rather than effortful. This is not a skill you trained, it's a condition you entered. Conditions shape behavior more effectively than instruction ever could. That's why nothing here has tried to motivate you. Motivation is unstable. It fluctuates. Conditions endure. If you look back over the duration of this video, you may realize that your attention never needed to be pulled forward. It stayed because it was allowed to rest. Resting attention is not disengaged, it's available. Availability is where learning actually occurs. You may also notice that some ideas introduced earlier now feel different, even though the words haven't changed. This is not reinterpretation, it's contextual shift. As context evolves, meaning reorganizes, This is why repetition in observation doesn't feel redundant. Each pass encounters a different internal landscape. There is no final insight waiting at the end of this, and that's intentional. Finality closes observation. Openness sustains it. If you're feeling a sense of incompleteness, that's not a flaw. It's an accurate reflection of how understanding actually works. It's never finished. It's only paused. Pauses are productive. They allow integration without effort. You don't need to remember everything that was said here. Memory is not the mechanism at work. Pattern recognition is. Patterns persist even when details fade. Later, you may notice yourself responding differently in situations that once felt automatic. Not because you applied something you learned, but because perception shifted earlier, quietly. That shift didn't need reinforcement. It already integrated. This is often where people look for the next step. But observation doesn't move in steps. It moves in continuities. You don't advance. You remain present. Remaining present doesn't require effort. It requires permission. Permission to not resolve. Permission to not conclude. Permission to let understanding remain partially formed. Most environments don't support this. They reward certainty. They reward speed. They reward clarity that arrives too early. Here, clarity is allowed to arrive when it's ready. If you choose to return to this channel, it doesn't have to be regular. It doesn't have to be intentional. Let it happen the same way this observation did, without demand. If you don't return, nothing is lost. Observation isn't owned. It isn't accumulated. It occurs where conditions allow. Before this video ends, take a moment to notice the quality of your attention right now, not its direction, its texture. Is it tight or open? Is it reaching or resting? That noticing is the only takeaway that matters. There is nothing to do with it, and that's exactly the point. If this space has been useful to you, not in what it gave you, but in how it allowed you to observe, you're welcome to stay connected, not out of loyalty, out of alignment. And now, there's no need to continue. Just notice what remains when the words stop.